This is Anna Patterson with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thanks so much for joining us for the housing call this morning. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Samuel Gunter.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you on the call this morning or on the podcast if you're listening later. It is quite a day and we've got a lot going on, so we're going to jump right in. So we're going to start at the federal level, but there are a couple of things that I really want to pull out today. One is at the federal level, the 21st Century ROAD to Housing Act passing in the Senate. We're going to talk a little bit about HB 437 that is running through the North Carolina General Assembly right now. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the State of the Nation's Housing Report that was released last week as well. So as we run through all these updates, just want to pick out those highlights and we'll dive a little bit deeper on those. So let's start federally with the 21st Century ROAD to Housing Act. This may finally pass Congress this week. So this is an opportunity for advocacy. Last week, the House and the Senate finally reached agreement on the 21st Century ROAD to Housing Act. And yesterday afternoon, the Senate voted 85-5 to pass the first comprehensive bipartisan housing package in over a decade. The bill is now on its way to the House, where they are expected to vote on it in the next few days. So we've been talking about this and the various iterations of this bill since last summer. And as we approach midterm elections in November, both sides are feeling pressure to show voters that they're doing something in response to increased housing costs around the country. You can see a section by section summary of the bill. There's a lot in there, and it's a lot of small things that tiny fixes to programs like HOME, not permanent authorization, but 3-year authorization of the CDBG disaster recovery program. There are pieces on rural housing service reform and investor pieces. There's stuff on manufactured housing, community investment and prosperity. There's a lot of little pieces for a number of different programs that have needed tweaks over the years. It is worth checking out the summary that is linked in the call notes so that you can see if this is something that impacts the programs that your organization takes advantage of. So there's a path to passage right now, and this is big news. Again, this is the first bipartisan comprehensive housing bill that will pass in over a decade. So it is worth spending some time with it. That's what's going on federally right now. There's more, but that's what we're going to focus on today. On the state side, we've been talking about House Bill 437, which is entitled the Drug-Free Homeless Surface Zones Unauthorized Public Camping bill. This, again, is a dangerous bill that is targeting the most vulnerable North Carolinians. And again, rather than focusing our energy and our resources on solutions to unsheltered homelessness, this bill criminalizes the crisis and adds more legal and financial pressures to local communities and governments to not to serve them, but to remove the visibility of their existence. It is a constant frustration of bills like these that have been filed around the country that they take a very visible problem and instead of dedicating resources to solving the problem, they dedicate the resources to removing the visibility of the problem. There's overwhelming support from members across the housing ecosystem, developers, local government, service providers, practitioners, ministers of faith, advocates. We've had more than 225 individuals and organizations signed on in opposition to the bill. It is moving quickly through the General Assembly. The Senate is expected to vote on it soon, and then it will go back to the House for a concurrence vote. It's not on the calendar today, but it is moving. So one of the major challenges of this bill is it's an unfunded mandate, right? It requires local governments to create these spaces that it does not fund, and it puts it makes localities legally accountable for unauthorized camping, or whether if they're not able to establish designated encampment areas that meet the requirements of the bill. It also establishes criminal penalties for operators of services and of campuses. Anyone within 100 feet of their campus violates this drug-free zone statute, meaning service providers, could be congregations, could be government agencies, they could be held liable for folks sleeping outside, whether or not they have anything to do with it. It's a troubling bill all around, and we urge you to reach out to your state senators right now. That's where the bill is at, but your state House members as well opposing this bill. And again, you can read more about this in the call notes. You can also still sign on to our letter in opposition. There are folks down at the General Assembly today taking meetings on this. So again, the House Bill 437, strongly in opposition. A couple of other things to note at the General Assembly. We are hearing rumblings that we may see a draft of a budget later this week. So keep an eye out for that. Obviously, we are paying very close attention to where the funding for the Housing Trust Fund and for the Workforce Housing Loan Program, among other things, lands in the budget draft. But we are hearing, again, rumors that we may see early draft of a budget later this week. The parking lot reform bill, House Bill 162, that would eliminate parking minimum statewide, goes before the Senate this morning. It's a bill that we've talked about on this call and that Stephanie has testified on at the General Assembly. Also on Friday, Governor Stein signed Senate Bill 889 into law. This is the law that temporarily blocks new property tax appraisals from being implemented in counties with more than 15,000 people. He also urged the Senate to pass Senate Bill 474, which would make small adjustments to the counties that are subject to Senate Bill 889, notably shielding Buncombe County from the property tax more than in his statements, Governor Stein noted that he's concerned that it would impact Buncombe County's ability to recover from Hurricane Helene. This session has been a session where we have been talking quite a bit about property taxes, property tax liability, how they are determined. For those of us like myself who live in Durham County and have been paying attention to the articles recently about property tax valuations, gaps in local government projected in their budgets due to undervaluing of properties for particularly commercial properties for the purposes of property tax collection. It's on everyone's mind. And it's on everyone's mind because, again, as we all know, housing costs and that housing affordability burden has crept further and further up the income ladder. And so more folks are paying attention to the margins, right? Not just their mortgage payment, but all the things around it, their utility bills, their property tax bills, and so on, as we all try and make the numbers work in our household budgets. And I think for us paying attention to what is going to actually provide real relief or what is a stopgap for folks. So we'll continue to talk about property taxes as a number of these other proposals are still before the General Assembly. But again, Governor Stein signed 889 into law, blocking new appraisals from being implemented in counties with more than 15,000 people. A couple of other state and local headlines to keep in mind before we jump into the State of the Nation's Housing Report. A 3-university collaborative, including University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, was selected as one of 10 academic teams advancing in the inaugural Housing Innovation Challenge, which is interesting. It's worth checking out. A couple of other pieces from around the state: city-owned land to become new affordable housing in downtown Raleigh. There's an article on Asheville and the Buncombe board voting to put $70 million in housing bonds on the November ballot. A couple of other articles about Juneteenth, about veterans housing, and a number of other things to check out in the call notes. Now, as we move on to the reports, events, and other resources, again, the big one is the release of the State of the Nation's Housing Report. This is an annual report put out by the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University. We talk about it regularly in this space because it gives us a sense of what's happening in the broader housing market nationally. There's a couple of themes I want to pull out, and I also want to read a little bit from the executive summary of the report, but a couple of highlights. So that low-cost housing remains scarce in spite of new construction softening vacancy rates. And that is a headline, that vacancy rates are going up. The other side of that, though, is that demand is softening significantly as we're seeing folks are not moving. And I'll read a little bit more about that in just a minute. So it highlights the low-cost housing remains scarce in spite of softening vacancy rates, that the cost burden is at a record high for renters and is rising for homeowners, and highlighting again that federal assistance is deeply inadequate, which in turn puts pressure on states and localities. Some of the pieces, though, that I want to pull out of here is the drivers of housing demand weakening that kind of leads their executive summary. And it's worth going through the data on this because there are a couple of things that I think are intuitive to folks and it gives language and data to kind of narrate what a lot of us are seeing. That the slowdown in housing growth partly reflects reduced household formation among young adults amid a weakened job market, burdensome student debt, and low consumer sentiment. And it pulls data around here, but I've talked to a number of you that as we think about housing costs and as your kids are getting to an age where they're graduating from high school, graduating from college, looking for jobs, trying to establish themselves, and you're worried about how your kids are going to be able to buy a home, that this pulls that out as a key data point driving the weakening of housing demand, that folks are forming their households later and later in life, are doubling up, moving back in with family, and that the delinquency rates on student loan debt has gone up significantly, right? Which is pushing, which is indicative of less hiring, fewer jobs being added to the U.S. economy, and that all of this is impacting housing costs. The other thing that is drawn out in the data in this report is articulating what, again, a lot of us talk about and a lot of us feel kind of intuitively about our housing market at the moment, is that many of us who either refinanced or bought at a time when mortgage rates were low and housing costs were significantly lower than they are now, feel locked into where we're at. And it notes that there is a lot less internal migration between states. Folks that were gaining a lot of population are not gaining it as rapidly. Folks that were losing a lot of population are not losing it as rapidly. We're not relocating for jobs. We're not relocating for housing because we feel stuck in what we've got, right? It pulls out a lot of that data and gives, I think, some language and some numbers behind what a lot of us have been feeling about the housing market. So it is well worth taking a look at the state of housing report, State of the Nation's housing report. Again, linked in our call notes for those of you who are going to check that out later. There's a couple of other pieces. The finance agency also put out a piece on North Carolina's population statistics over the last 5 years. And again, I want to note that over the last 5 years, between 2020 and 2025, North Carolina grew by more than 500,000 people, 560,000 people. That nearly half of that was just Wake and Mecklenburg County. And then another 88,000 of that was just Guilford, Durham, Forsyth, and New Hanover counties. That we grew. That growth was not even across the state. It was very concentrated in our more urban counties. We did see some counties with population loss, mostly in the Northeast. But that dynamic is, again, that population increase, while we are still growing, some of the things that are highlighted in the report in Harvard State of the Nation's housing report about that I mentioned, that places that have been shedding population like California, Illinois, places that have been gaining population like Texas and Florida, which were the two named in the executive summary, but that also includes North Carolina, that population growth is slowing as well. So those are well worth checking out. A couple of other items to note before I let you go for the day. We have a couple of webinars. Federal Fair Housing Basics is being put on Wednesday, June 24th from 2 to 3 by Justice in Aging. The National Fair Housing Alliance is hosting their 2026 conference, Building the Future We Deserve, Solutions for America's Fair and Affordable Housing Crisis, from June 27th to 30th at the Capitol Hilton in Washington, D.C. There are virtual and in-person registration options available, and the cost varies. But again, June 27th through the 30th, the National Fair Housing Alliance is hosting their 2026 conference. National Low Income Housing Coalition has a advocacy toolkit training in disaster housing recovery on Tuesday, June 30th from 2 to 3:30 that you can learn more about and register for in the call notes. And the National Alliance to End Homelessness is hosting their 2026 conference in Capitol Hill Day from July 8th to 10th in Washington, D.C. And again, you can see all of that in the call notes. Again, to wrap up, the big items from this week are the 21st Century Road to Housing Act passing in the Senate and going back to the House for concurrence. First comprehensive housing bill to pass in Congress in more than a decade. We also have House Bill 437. This is the unfunded mandate and criminalization of homelessness bill that is moving in the General Assembly. There's still opportunity to sign on to our letter in opposition and to call your state senator and state house members to oppose the passage of this bill. And then finally, the State of the Nation's Housing Report was released this last week and is well worth spending some time with for those of you who talk about housing and housing costs with folks who support your organizations, who are making policy in your communities, and so on. Thank you all for joining us. As always, I hope you have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time.